Favorite comfort food?
Dim sum,
What are the dishes you're getting?
腸粉.
Okay.
Lately in Toronto,
Yeah.
they will serve Calbee style ribs with this Maggie sauce.
Really? It's either innovative or sacrilegious.
Yes, probably a little bit of both.
Welcome to the Dad Bod, a podcast that tells the story of what it means to be a dad today, one dad at a time. My name is Sean, and I'm a dad living in New York City with my wife and our two young native New Yorkers. The formula for the Dad Bod is simple. Each episode, we're going to interview one dad to get his story of being a dad. Over time, all of these stories will start to create the bigger story of what it means to be a dad today. The voice you heard at the opening of the show belongs to today's guest, my friend and fellow dad, Andrew. Not only is dim sum Andrew's favorite comfort food, it is also a great metaphor for his family story, a multi-generational family meal that gained full citizenship at the expansive culinary tables of Canada and the United States, and where values, lessons, and customs are circulated with as much sincerity and fervor as the dishes themselves. Andrew and I have been friends for about as long as we've both been dads, in part because our daughters were born around the same time and have become better and better friends themselves over the years. I'm so glad that Andrew and I were able to sit down for this extended conversation, because Andrew is someone I see on a pretty regular basis, but the circumstances always make it hard to go deep on the things that are going on in life and that are on our minds. As you'll hear, Andrew has some very thoughtful perspectives and visions to share on a wide range of topics that he's passionate about, including raising Asian American kids, his vision for leadership being taught in the future as a fundamental skill, and of course, what's going on with his dad bod. But before we get into these topics, we're going to open with Andrew introducing himself and reflecting on his childhood and his parents. As I listened back on my conversation with Andrew, I came away with a subtle but powerful feeling of connection that extends from his parents, their personal histories and how they raised Andrew and his sister, to how Andrew approaches being a dad today. I have a lot more thoughts to share about Andrew's story, but I'll save those for a bonus episode in the future. For now, let's get right to it. Andrew, dim sum dad. Let's get this started. Introduce yourself. Give me your name, where you live, your dad profile / resume, if you will, and any other hats that you wear that you feel are worth mentioning.
Sure. My name is Andrew. I reside in New York City. I've got 4 kids. One of them's passed on, but 3 kids still around. And, they're range between 8 and 2. I work in finance in the trading space, and I would say also locally or within my organization or within my company, I started to get into servant leadership in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. So I'm pretty passionate about that and talent development.
We've been friends for years now, but like a lot of us that know each other, there's a lot we don't know about each other.
Yep.
So tell me a little bit about your background. Like, where'd you grow up and what was it like growing up there?
Sure. So I'm originally from Canada. I grew up in Toronto. Notice I said Toronto because Torontonians will call Toronto as opposed to Toronto and pronouncing all the syllables. I grew up on the north side of the city, and my parents were from Hong Kong. And when we were younger, we didn't, your classic middle class family. Your parents are just trying to hustle to level up. They didn't have great means, but they emphasized education. I think the one thing looking back that I valued and didn't realize was uncommon was my mom had insisted on us being more well-rounded. As Canadians, she expected us to learn how to ski and skate. And as a kid from Toronto, I liked playing hockey, but different things too. So swimming, piano, I was in Boy Scouts for a bit. There's just a variety of different things I tried. And I think the variety of activities was pretty valuable in the sense that it gave you an opportunity to meet different people from different walks of life. And even now, these skills are sometimes what distinguish you. So for instance, my daughter has a daddy-daughter ski trip. There's a big skating event every year, and not everyone can ski and skate well. I'm not that strong of a skier, but I can get by. But in this, literally in the arena, I'm probably one of the better skaters amongst the dads.
You crush it.
Yeah, I do okay, and I think that well-roundedness is something that I think was valuable for me. So I'm trying to think about that for our kids, not necessarily having them be experts, or people love the term SMEs, or like subject matter experts now. I'd rather them be Jacks or Jills of all trades.
Got it.
Masters of none at this point.
So you kind of attribute that push to be well-rounded to your mom.
Yeah. And both sets of my grandparents happened to live within like a 2-mile radius of where we were. So I think it got a little bit from each of the grandparents as well. My dad started his own architecture firm after he got laid off from his first job. So he was always hustling. He would work pretty long hours. He probably wouldn't be back till like dinner time. And so he was definitely present. He was very warm. He was big on travel, larger than life kind of personality, which I probably adopted some of his traits. In high school, a lot of my classmates would take summer school and they would be studying, and my dad wouldn't have it. He was like, you enjoy your summer, either go to camps or like do something else. I didn't want you to focus on the education piece. There's plenty of time to figure things out later.
Where do you think your dad and your mom too, so it's hard for me to parse, sort of, it sounds like they definitely had a good collaboration, the two of them. Where do you kind of point their approach and their philosophy? For sure feels like they are leaving a legacy, in the values that they've raised you by, and by doing so have passed on to you. Where do they get it from, you think?
I think a lot of the values were common based on background and tradition. So most East Asian parents are going to emphasize education, respect for elders, hard work, allowing your work to sort of speak for itself. Mm-hmm. So I think those were common elements, and they were very aligned. Mm-hmm. So academic excellence was obviously demanded of us. And, if you're going to do something, you want to do it really well. So they had high standards. So I think that was probably more the commonality, and it's probably common background really helped. My parents are very different people. My mom basically handles everything, and my dad, when he was still around, he was pretty mercurial on the things that he knew really well. When he moved to Toronto, he moved with his younger sister, and there was just the two of them. Probably some sense of abandonment. I don't know whether he was compensating with us, but he definitely had some pretty strong feelings, like very passionate about his love language was like, giving you big hugs, like speaking to you, like telling you how much he loved you, telling you how much he cared, which is something that I probably carry forward as well. So I think that kind of really came into his parenting style. Whereas my mom, she had 6 siblings. Her elder brother passed away of a heart attack fairly young, in his 50s. but she was the second mom in effect because her parents were dirt poor and they were always working. So when you have, 5 younger siblings looking up to you, she's really the big sister. She really is like the extra mom. So I think that's always the way that she's been. So she was already well practiced by the time we came around.
I never got to meet your dad, but just hearing what you're saying about him, the experience of abandonment, or let's just call it the facts, sent with his younger sister to another country at an age that definitely hard to imagine many people having to go through that. And yet with that also being a very tender or very affectionate, outwardly affectionate dad. And from a culture that is stereotypically dads not being that affectionate. So how does that all come out in him, you think? Like some of those things that look kind of at the surface like contradictions.
That's a great question. I think he aspired to be what he wanted to be, or what he felt he was missing from his parents when he came over. From what I understand, he was always a pretty boisterous kind of guy as a kid. But then when you come over here and you're not necessarily getting the, we talk about it a lot these days, the social and emotional learning element. I think there's a lot of parents that have no idea of what that means. And he just tried to emphasize how much he cared about people. And, the constant is that he loves you and he cares. I think there's definitely power in consistency of messaging. So at least you knew where you stood with him, both vocally and how he expressed it. And like you said, most East Asian dads are, your classic dad from prior generations. They're not sitting there, pulling your kid aside, hugging them, and telling them how much they love them all the time. As a person who's traded a lot and has gone through a lot of cycles in terms of how your risk can start to get into your psyche, and when you start unfortunately bringing your work home. In fact, I have like a list of training rules, and one of them says, leave your work at work.
Mm-hmm.
I think he had a difficult time with that, just given that he was an entrepreneur and he basically, whatever he was passionate about, he was living it all the time.
Right. There were no boundaries.
No, there weren't. And so there was a couple of things. Like one, he just didn't know how to regulate. And I'm not really sure if he had any self-awareness. He had intent around self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
I think his ego was a bit more tied to where he was strong. And so it's really hard for any person, and like you were talking about, like any men or dads, to be vulnerable, because it's not what you grew up seeing or not what you know.
Right. Right. How has your dad made you a better man? And by both good example or bad example.
He perseveres, or he persevered. I was saying this to him quite often over the past decade or so, that I had such immense respect for his path, meaning that he was an entrepreneur. And for him, when he left his original firm, he partnered with another guy. He found the right complement of skill set, and the two of them kept on finding different partners, so they found one that worked. And they started a firm together that was quite successful. to do that takes a lot of guts. It takes a lot of confidence in your skills. It takes underlying talent. And I think the partnership was pretty important. I have no idea whether the partnership was by design, but what I would say is that his force of personality is probably what drew his partner in, and that's why they ended up working well together. So I think the confidence to be able to see things that he understood, and once he understood it, or once he saw something that he had conviction in, he didn't waver. And oftentimes when I run into people or I talk to different people, you see some people, they're just relentless and they understand, they know their craft, but some of them lack confidence. Other people, they have like a combination of those. They have strengths in both of those areas, so that ends up being a big part of their foundation for their success. And I think as like what I don't know if he intentionally or unintentionally left me with, or if these are traits that I just share with him. I think at times I have some pretty strong irrational confidence in certain areas, but then I guess talking to the weaknesses, I think with that kind of strength comes some pretty deep insecurities on where you aren't as good.
Right.
I think discipline wasn't one of his strong suits. And I think I wouldn't attribute this to him per se, but I believe that your children or younger generations end up modeling after their parents one way or another. The unintentional modeling happens all the time. So oftentimes when I think about parenting, I realize that the more that I invest in trying to fix any deficiencies or work on any strengths, there's probably a strong message in the back that's hitting your kids or being delivered to your children, that they're observing you in this way, actively or passively. That is probably more important. And so bringing it back to your original question, I think I've recognized that there's certain things that he did really well that I probably absorbed and that I didn't give it significant credit when I was younger. But the benefit of being a parent now, and if our priority is to be good stewards for our children, oftentimes we think of teaching them or showing them or either asking them questions or telling them what to do. Probably unintentionally telling them what to do more than asking questions. And oftentimes you want to ask questions. But it's not just the direct communication that matters. It's the indirect communication, and it's not just the direct interactions that matter. It's the observations that you don't know, that you just can't see, and that you're not necessarily an active party to.
Got it.
So I would say that as I grow older, I have an awareness that I've developed more of an awareness that how I behave, even though I think isn't giving off certain byproducts, it certainly does. It does. Both in the workplace as a manager, so I manage a team. I'm seen as a pretty senior social presence on the floor. And as a parent, where, I've got 3 kids that I'm trying to teach and bring along and protect. I think that matters a lot. It matters more to sort of not just work on how you parent, but work on yourself to make sure that, let's use this term they have in investing, when you're active and passive investing or compounding or whatnot. I think that how you are kind of like gives off some side effect or some signal, and that is a part of what your children and people that you lead absorb from you.
What are some things that you hope your kids pick up on from you? Basically, you as an example. It's almost, as you were talking about it, I was seeing like 3 tiers. of parenting action in a way, 3 categories.
Right.
Category 1 is like, do this, don't do that. The direct parenting. Then there's the next level of asking questions. And then there's this other level of what we are communicating to, and I guess maybe bidirectionally with our kids in the way that we just act and in the example that we set. And I think that it may not be that that's more powerful, but I would say that the power is more hidden. So for you then, in that third category of the things that you are communicating, the things that you are parenting with, without saying or asking anything directly of your kids, what do you hope that your kids are taking?
One point of clarification on that second layer is when I'm talking about asking questions, it's more to get them to think about
Like
things.
rhetorical or Socratic kind of questions.
Yeah. Or rather than telling them, asking, or you highlight something. I think it's arguably different, but also perhaps it's obvious. It could be the same thing as level 1, but more effective because it's less directional. But going back to the question, I think that sense of personal responsibility is a big one, where you just want to make sure that you're taking care of your family and yourself, and that part is secure.
Got it.
So there's one concept that I've been thinking for a long time, even before I had kids. It started when there's one guy used to work for me. He now works in London, but he grew up in a small town outside of Pittsburgh. It seemed like he and his siblings were all fairly successful, and I'm always curious to hear from different people what their family environment was like. And this kid's EQ, well, he's not a kid, he's like a father of 2, but this guy's EQ is off the charts. He just I felt like he was much stronger on an EQ or in self-awareness perspective and how to interact with people. And one of the things that he spoke about was his parents would just expect him to take responsibility at an earlier age. And so I have this view, well, I often think about what your values are, what your mission is for the particular job that you have. And as a parent, my view is that my job is to help set them up and achieve launch. And how you achieve launch is that they have to be able to take care of themselves. So oftentimes when I used to talk to this guy, I was brought up this concept called like the handoff, which is more responsibility that you pass on to your child at an earlier point in time when they're ready to handle it. And sometimes even as a stretch piece, they develop more reps at an earlier age where it's easier to learn, and they'll be able to learn those soft elements or soft responsibility elements at a young age. So as a parent, if I can create an environment where I have my eldest understanding that and taking more of that responsibility, then that models it for the second kid and then the third kid, and it goes from there. So I think that's the one thing I think about often, which is what can I do to sort of model taking that personal responsibility? And it can come in different forms. It can be like I'm washing the dishes, or I'm cleaning up, or when I get home after work, I'm still doing some of these other chores that they visibly see. I'm not always perfect. Like there's sometimes like I'm probably on my phone too much, or like I'll pass out because I'm just spent. But I try really hard to come back and do things. And then when they point out that I'm on my phone a lot or doing something else, then I keep trying to, rather than arguing with them, I try to be more conscious of like what I'm going to do for the next little while, so that the consistent viewpoint that they have is something different what they knew from before.
And, speaking of that, I mean, you and I, we chat regularly, but it's also in settings where inevitably, like, life interrupts and we don't get to go that deep into things. Nevertheless, one thing that comes up, whether in the foreground or the background a lot, is raising kids that are Asian American. Really curious to hear some of your perspectives, some of the wisdom that you're trying to pass on.
I didn't grow up here. Where I grew up wasn't far geographically, but from a philosophical point of view, the countries are very different. The cities are very different. A variety of these like social studies courses that we took in Canada as kids would talk about the difference between Canada and the United States, in the sense that in Canada it's very much a cultural mosaic. So you're free to be in your pocket where you can celebrate your culture. That can be the priority. No one's gonna force Canadiana down your throat. It's important, you learn about in school, and there's patriotism, but there's less of an emphasis to assimilate. Whereas in this country, you're kind of American. People kind of talk about that piece first. I think the other difference was that when I grew up, like East Asians were not the minority. If you go to Toronto and you look at a lot of the companies, especially in the financial district, the non-executive levels are chock full of people of East Asian and South Asian descent, just everywhere. So it's, when I was growing up in primary school, maybe there are fewer Asian kids, but there's still quite a few. Middle school, even more. High school, tons. And by the time you're in university, you just gravitate towards folks of that background. And so my experience growing up as a Canadian-born Chinese versus American-born Chinese, I think it's very different. When I arrived in this country and talking to more Asian Americans, their experiences are so different. And actually, I'd probably ask you later on, like, what your experiences is growing up in Arizona. But I'm aware that the otherness and the balance around assimilation is pretty, like, people are going to ask themselves these questions. Kids are going to ask themselves these questions, and it's much more in the, I guess, day-to-day these days. I haven't really started broaching the subject with our kids that much, but in our household, we will talk about the fact that our background is Chinese. And I think it's important to talk about the culture, talk about what we look like, talk about who we are, because that's going to be a part of your identity no matter what. And this concept that the otherness is always going to exist here. So when we talk, I have a lot of different discourse with a lot of different people, but when you're talking about Stop Asian Hate, when you're trying to ask people to help you out and help fight certain trends, identifying them is really important. I don't discount that. I think early days you can be kind of skeptical and that you're going to receive any help, but if you're not being vocal about it, you won't receive that at all. I bring that piece up is because oftentimes I'll be asked by different people from older generations or even the current generation, like, how do you ever feel safe in a country that has like gun violence and that the possibility of racism is there, because perpetually you're going to be the other. And so I think it's just illustrating the fact that these things exist and making sure that your children are aware at an earlier age so that they can help in the right way. Like, you just don't want to be hitting them with everything at once. But the earlier they know, you're not hiding around it, and then they can figure out for themselves how are they going to navigate that piece. So my wife and I often talk about that, where we're talking about our background, talking about our culture, making sure they're aware. When we're coming to school decisions, we recently had our second child. They were going to attend a private school in the city, and the one that we ended up picking, from the remaining crop of schools, we ended up picking the one that looked and felt the most diverse. And so I think it's still important to us. We want our kids to be able to feel comfortable in their own skin, but still finding different ways to assimilate and meet people in their own environments. And I think that's just something that we don't shy away from. Yeah, I touched upon earlier that I'm interested in diversity, equity, inclusion, but I would say that I'm not necessarily deeply well studied in terms of the research. But the practical concepts, I think, that come into play are, you need to know what you're like and what people you get along with are like. And then you need to figure out how you want to meet people halfway. And so you try to preach curiosity versus judgment, asking questions versus making statements. And I think that's pretty important.
It's interesting hearing you talk because makes me feel, on the one hand, things they're talking about, I totally get it. And on the other hand, I feel like the proverbial fish who doesn't know what water is like. So just to try to suss that out a little bit, how do you think you would be raising your kids differently if they were being raised in Canada?
I don't know. I think that's a difficult question to answer, because if you're asking how I would do it if I were to move there now, I think I would still be discussing the subject matter. I think the other thing is, philosophically, I think there are some elements of New York that I like. It's competitive. There's a closer degree of meritocracy. I do appreciate what capitalism brings to the table, like some of it. And I think it's a pretty fascinating place to grow up and to, figure yourself out. I don't necessarily think I would change that approach if I were to move. I would argue that the cultural mosaic piece actually makes it even harder to relate with people that don't look like you.
Interesting. So cultural mosaic was a term you used to describe what it was like growing up in Canada.
Yeah. So
right?
let me be very specific, or delve a bit deeper. I think there's something to be said on understanding and trying to understand all different types of groups and having an ability to engage in discourse with as many different types of people as you can. And, we kind of touched upon this before all our podcast piece, but, talking about private schools in New York City, one of the ancillary benefits is that you're going to be in a school where you're meeting people of different backgrounds. And the hope is that your shared history and your ability to observe people in that environment, you can know how you're going to talk to other people. I talked to another dad. He grew up in Brooklyn. He went to some private school, and he's sending his kid to another school that I was a bit surprised that his son was going to go there, just because I didn't think it was necessarily diverse. But he had a few more objective reasons why he did it. He's a physician. There's some people he knew in his circle that really recommended that school, and that school's actively trying to become a bit more diverse. But he also pointed out that a large degree of his success, not a large degree, but a part of his success is probably attributable to the fact that he is able to relate to people that are not like him. And that really struck a chord with me, because this was a conversation we probably had within the last 6 months. If you kind of distill it down, the earlier that you can teach your kids how to be socially and emotionally aware and understand empathy and understand how to ask questions and being curious, they learn that at a young age. Mm-hmm. You can conceptually understand things as you're older, but to apply it in practice is hard, and to find the time to do it is hard. So it's just much easier if you can kind of get this piece earlier. So my hope is that if I work on this piece of me. I share some of the lessons with them, and then they learn this, and it gets reinforced in their school, because actually the school that my second kid's going to has adopted a very similar social emotional learning framework that my eldest is going to. I think that they will have an advantage that is not necessarily as advertised. Because oftentimes people are talking about academics, like math, like AI, like coding. That stuff is important, and they're probably going to get it. And if they're curious, they'll figure that out. The undercovered or underappreciated element is, can your kid lead people? Can they just talk to people? Can they respect boundaries and recognize them? These are, can they have healthy emotional relationships with all sorts of people without feeling too much guilt or anger or resentment? They understand boundaries, they understand connection, they understand how to serve and when to serve. I think that's very powerful. And so that's why I think like tying it all together, coming back to like the Canada question, I don't think I would have changed my approach to parenting regardless as to where I am geographically. Now, maybe if I was growing up, we moved to Singapore or Hong Kong or, Seoul or some place where, I didn't speak the language, but it was still people look like me, maybe that would matter. But I think there would be a different nuance to your otherness while you're there.
So it ties in with something you were saying earlier about just the example. So on this topic of, hard to put a simple label on it, awareness of others, appreciation for others, appreciation for oneself, one's own background, all these things, just the broader social emotional learning. You have chosen schools in part for your kids because of their strengths or their focus or their approach to this overall topic. And you also recognize that this is a topic that you yourself are working on at the same time. So you are almost kind of taking the same course as your own kids. So what does your coursework in this area look like these days, so to speak? How's it going? How are you developing? How are you struggling with it?
I've been fortunate where there have been certain people in my life that recognized my intent, and despite the fact that I may have acted in such a way that could be off-putting, they were able to see through it. I had an experience where one of the people I work with pulled me aside to say, they stated, I don't really mind the way that we communicate, but I don't know if you noticed, but a lot of people in our general vicinity are uncomfortable. And normally I wouldn't have really cared too much, but the fact that this person demonstrated this grace to highlight this element, it really struck me. And so I think it's the fact that I have had the grace of different people being willing to sort of share these elements with me and being patient with me, that I can continue to learn some of these elements. I also have like a partner who is much stronger at that. Like her strengths there are very much there. And so she's trying to teach me things all the time. And frankly, this comes up in conversation with colleagues and my spouse, where sometimes they'll stop a conversation and be like, well, you know what, this isn't something I'm going to be able to have the time or energy to teach you. And frankly, I'm fortunate that these people, like my wife and these other coworkers, were willing to do that. Mm-hmm. And so I think I do try to read a bit. I try to learn, like read books or listen to podcasts, or try to absorb some of that information in different areas. And I've tried to serve. So I talked about the diversity, equity, inclusion piece. I was recently nominated to attend a directorship program through some pretty prominent organization that supports Asian Americans. And so I'm hoping that directorship course allows me to learn different things. I've been asked by a organization that is trying to foster or like create a funnel or ways for local New Yorkers that don't have access to finance jobs a path onto Wall Street. And so I might end up joining the board there. I do want to come up with either a playbook or institutionalize some of these things. I mentioned earlier that I'm interested in talent development. It's more diverse talent development. I might not have a massive audience to share these learnings with, but I'm in the sort of learning point and like concept building point. But there might be a point where I want to create a program for probably kids of East Asian descent or like Asian descent first, and then eventually sort of maybe roll out to a broader spectrum. You don't want to kind of like narrow down the focus of your audience too much, because the commonality is like, hey, if you understand both the how to connect with people, you're probably better as a leader, as a marketer, as a business person, as a human being. Those all kind of come into play. And if I can find a way to do that, I'm not sure what community that would be useful in servicing, but I wrestle with it all the time. Is it a leadership concept? Is it a teaching concept? Is it a parenting concept? And I haven't fully fleshed it out yet, but if I were to suddenly be out of work, I wanted to take a shot at doing something interesting or something that interested me, that's probably what I would look
Interesting. At. So what is it that kind of about this topic that animates you, or how is it that it animates you to this degree? Why does it matter enough to push on this? And to the degree that if you were to win the lottery, let's say, not be out of a job, let's say not need a job anymore, you say that if I were to try to do something interesting, it would be in this area. Like, that's a big deal. Anything that you would want to do if you didn't even, that you would do for free, that this rises to, at or near the top of your list. Why is that?
The world is short leadership. It's short on leadership. It's short on leadership, and it's short on intentional talent development. And I think oftentimes when they think, we're short on leaders, it's these biblical figures that are blessed and that rise out of different populations or that are called upon. But leadership can be a skill set, and it starts with the ability to communicate, the ability to empathize. Leading small groups, big groups, takes reps, takes learning. If you kind of introduce these concepts at an earlier age, it's kind of like how a lot of people are talking about financial literacy. If you ask a person on the street, hey, is a leadership skill a good skill? Financial literacy is a good skill. They immediately tell, oh, of course, that's great. Like, we need to do that. How do you do that? Oh, no, we should introduce that in the schools. Okay, we can't even get average scores for certain schools, and then not even getting into how we measure scores, or how, once you have hard measurements, it becomes gaming those scores. I don't think you need. I think it's a difficult area to develop the right intellectual thought process within a corporate environment. So you could argue there's probably research in universities that do it, but I think there's something to be said that even those ivory towers are too slow at pushing down concepts. And so now we're in this environment where technology and where it's like either communication distribution, where we're doing a podcast. So someone doing a podcast or someone having a website, and if they get adopted quicker, they could probably get their concept out faster. Now it may not be as well researched, so I kind of care about figuring that piece out. But I think going back to your core question, the world is short on leadership. I'm not asking, like, from a parenting perspective, I'm not asking my kids to be leaders. I just want them to have the potential to be leaders. And then they'll probably accidentally do it. And they will be able to lever that skill much better than anybody else because we prioritize that. And it's the real, like, undeveloped field that people don't emphasize. Like, people are talking about it, and there's definitely areas of study, but I don't think it's necessarily emphasized in parenting as much.
Certainly not a primary.
No.
And it's not part of the table stakes.
There's no RSM or there's no Kumon or extracurricular sports activity for leadership. People will be like, oh, or social emotional learning. It's typically like, oh, well, you do some sports and then you're going to either coach people or learn from different people. It's not, it's a byproduct of those environments, but it's not necessarily taught. And yes, now, like, we pick schools that they do that. And arguably, like, we know public school educators and they are clearly aware of that area of study, but they're probably going to have to teach you a test to some degree, right?
Certainly.
Yeah.
So you're clearly a leader. Has becoming or being a dad changed you as a leader, do you think?
Yeah, I certainly think I'm more mature and a bit more aware of how, emphasizing praise of action and focusing on process is so important, and having a longer perspective. Mm-hmm. When you're called upon to be a leader or a parent, you need to be patient with these human beings that are counting on you. And then I've kind of applied in the workplace where, like, I need to be patient with people as well.
So I did want to kind of get your story about your dad bod. What's going on with it? What are some of the challenges? What are some of the successes that you've been having?
So I had started running 2 years ago, and before I got injured, I had dropped like a ton of weight. I think I was down from my worst weight somewhere in the realm of like 50 pounds. I unfortunately have gained quite a bit of it back, and so now I'm trying to reverse course a bit. I think that I'm not taking the steps to do it, but if I refocus myself towards what my goal was, I definitely want to be smaller over the long run, just because physically it's probably just better for me. The other piece is I think stress has really, like, picked up for me over the past 6 months, or 6 months to like a year and change. So my dad passing away suddenly in late 2022, my long-term boss and mentor retiring in January of this year. There's just these two, like, my dad and then like this big brother figure, both of these people no longer being around in my day-to-day. It's just like a pretty significant removal. The other thing is, like, I'm the sole breadwinner for my family. My wife decided to step back from work just to be there. And I think it was really important because for our kids' social emotional learning, she's the one who's got the strongest skill set. So to be able there, being present, I think that's like a big part of it, where if you have a parent there, teaching your kids is pretty important. I think the thing preventing me from getting refocused on getting healthy is just giving it its fair share of time. But if you kind of characterize everything together, if you prioritize the things that are important to you, then you start to de-emphasize some of the things that become less important to you. So I think from the dad bod point of view, it's not just like the physical piece, which obviously matters a ton, but the mental piece and the stress piece are things that I've been thinking a lot about recently.
That's definitely like some big loss that you mentioned, your dad and big brother figure at work. That stress and just stress in general, do you have ways that you manage it? How are those methods helping?
I haven't really been doing that as much lately. So I think the running probably had helped before, where you're running, you get that exercise, you get that release. I think that I need to just prioritize that.
What's your vision for where exercise fits into your life, like routine wise or whatnot? How's it going to look?
Ideally in the mornings, just because when you're parenting 3 children and you have a demanding job, I just don't see where you can find the time. And so it's kind of this, I won't call it death spiral, but a spiral where weekend you're like, you sleep and you recover, you need comfort. And then you get back to work on Monday and then you're going full tilt. And like you get back on the evenings, your kids are tired because they have extracurricular activities. And the time between when you get to back home and when they go to bed is process.
Mm-hmm.
And you do that for 4 days a week. And then Friday, everyone's just like passed out. And then you cycle through 7 days all over again. That's what it feels like right now. And the funny thing is that you would think that if there's a weekend or in a trip or an event, that it would be worthwhile looking forward to. But all it ends up doing is just creating even more stress, and it just adds to that pile. So we were in Orlando for a bit and we had a good time, but I don't really want to spend a holiday break, like a Christmas holiday break, with splitting it to 2 different places ever again with 3 children, because it's so onerous. But yeah, I'm trying to find a way to break the cycle, because it's like you're in this loop, but you have to crack the loop somehow, right, and then create some new loop. I don't know, maybe I'll get it to it. I probably should get some sleep tonight and then figure it out.
I'm probably not helping you right now, but I do think you're going to figure it out. You've got your sights on it. I think you're going to figure it out. And you were there. I mean, that is amazing. Dropping 50 pounds is crazy.
Yeah, and I want to
crazy.
I want to drop like another 50 pounds from here. So it's tough because you want to get to it. And I think it's just adjusting lifestyle is very hard.
Yeah. So to kind of close out things, the one kind of requirement we have of every guest of the Dad Bod is to refer another dad to be a guest on the Dad Bod.
Ooh.
So this would be a dad that you think would be a great guest, which generally means you admire, their work as a dad. You admire what they do. You admire what you've observed of them. And then the other wrinkle to this is that you would have to help get them on the Dad Bod. So who's a dad you'd recommend? Who's a dad you'd refer?
So I have a friend who's based in Taiwan that I would recommend.
Okay.
So this was a friend that we met in New York City X number of years ago, and they made a conscious decision that they had highlighted that the best years to spend with your children were the first 10. and they put their money where their mouth is. So they spend an incredible amount of time with them. They moved to another country where they thought they would be able to spend more time with them. They travel a ton. They are entrepreneurs. It's, they have their kids exposed to different things. And I think that he's a big part of, I think he drives a lot of that agenda. I mean, they're partners, he and his wife, but I think he drives that. I think he would be a fascinating interview.
Okay. I would love to talk with him.
He's like I often joke with my wife that I wish that I could do what they do, but I'm clearly a little bit too attached to my job, for better or for worse. But I admire the fact that they are literally living the dream, which is they prioritize spending time with their children. They've geared their entire life around that, and their life's fine.
Well, let's see if we can get him.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Let's see if we can get him. Well, Andrew, thank you very much for doing this with me. I hope you had even a fraction of the fun that I had doing this and just getting to enjoy this really great conversation.
It was a good time. Thanks very much for having me.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Cheers.
Okay. Episode 3 of the Dad Bod is in the books. Thank you to everyone for listening. I hope you found it enjoyable and that it brought a little something positive to your life. Big thanks to today's guest, Andrew, for sharing his story. If you like what we're trying to do with the Dad Bod, hit the subscribe button in your podcast app and post up a positive review. If you know a dad who would be great for the show, go to thedadbodpod.com and tap the Refer a Dad button. Thanks again for listening.